What's up, gang? Welcome to The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mirshahzadeh. I'm so pumped to have you here with me. Now listen, The Greatness Machine, we're about two things. Number one, people who are living their passions. And number two, those who are creating greatness in the world and doing both of these things despite the odds against them. Each episode, we're going to feature interviews with game changers, business leaders, telling us their origin stories, what made them tick, what got them to where they are now. Why? So it can help you step into your greatness within your life, your business, and your career. Occasionally, you might hear a few solo episodes from myself, moi, as I say, as I leverage my 20 years of entrepreneurship as a CEO and founder to help you grow and level up in your journey to scale your life and your business. So come be a fly on the wall, enjoy the conversation, and I'm stoked to have you here with me. Guys, welcome to today's episode of The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mirshahzadeh, and boy, do we have a special guest. Tad Stoermer is in the house. What's up, Tad?
It is all this craziness going on. So that's what's up. Everything.
Yeah, right.
Everything all at once. Everything happening all at once. That's
everything happening all at once is probably a beautiful way of describing it, guys. So first of all, for those of you guys that don't know Tad, we'll be getting into his background on the show, but he's a historian in American resistance history, and I don't even know. Like the audience knows. Like I come across people's content, and if I and I'll start following it, and the more I follow the content, if I'm really into it, I'm a selfish SOB. I'm like, put them on the list. Let's see if they'll come on the show. And that's like probably my biggest gift of doing the show is getting to meet amazing people like Tad. So I've been following Tad. You guys all know I'm about as politically moderate as you can get, and but I'm a history lover, and I really love his content around American resistance history. So I asked him on the show. He's so gracious to say yes. So we're really pumped to have you here, Tad. Thank you for coming on today.
No, it's really my pleasure. Thank you.
You guys, so Tad, you're very welcome. So Tad is, I'm going to give you guys formal bio, and then we'd love to, I actually forgot to mention this pre-show. We love some origin story. We'd love to hear, like, how'd you become what you've become? But I'm going to give you guys Tad's background really quickly, and then we're going to get to some origin story, and then we're going to talk about what the hell's going on in the world today and how it relates to the book he's writing. You guys, Tad has a PhD in history from the University of Virginia. He also has additional alumni status from both Johns Hopkins and Harvard. Plus, he's taught public history at both Harvard and Johns Hopkins. He has his new book coming out in June. He's author of the Resistance History of the United States, and that's coming out June 2nd. So really looking forward to that book coming out. And then he's also one of the most widely followed public historians right now. He's reaching millions monthly. If you guys will be giving his social handles out during the show, but if you guys want to really check out some amazing information about like what's happening in the world today, especially in the United States, has happened many, many, many times over. This is not the first. That's what got me hooked. And I'll say this, like, how long are the pieces you put out on social roughly? Like 5 minutes, 4 minutes?
Yeah, they're between 5 and 10 minutes. I tend not to go over that.
I like, there's very few pieces of like 5 to 10 minute content that I just sit there and eat the whole thing. Like, and probably most people are like that too. And
I'm like that.
What's that?
I'm like that. Sure.
Yeah. Because it's like, look, man, like you got to earn people's attention. I will tell you, there's at least a 75% chance, if I have time, that if I see a Tad piece, I'm watching the whole thing. Unless I'm busy. If I'm busy, then I'm like, oh, I got to get back to that. I'll bookmark it. So I was curious, like when you put pieces out in content, like is your percentage viewed like super high on most of your stuff?
It is, particularly it's higher on some platforms than on others. On YouTube, because people sort of strap in for this, it's shockingly high. So there are two kinds of people who come to my content. There are either folks who bail out in the first 5 seconds, or folks who strap in for most of it. And that's gratifying, because it's not like I'm Brad Pitt, and it's not like I'm doing some sort of cool dance. Is that what you're doing is, as you say, you get the content, you get what I got. And it's heartening, and that people are sticking around for that.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably like, to your point, I unfortunately, I don't think the TikTok crowd's probably sitting through, well, I think your clips can only be short on that one anyway, but yeah, it's probably for much more of like a people that are really interested in history audience, right? Which should be everybody if you want to understand what the hell's going on in the world today. So Tad, I'd love, here at the Greatness Machine, we love origin stories. I'm assuming you didn't wake up a historian. Maybe you had a love of history. I've always loved history. When I was a kid, I loved history. I considered almost getting a degree in history, and then went for the economic stuff. But which, interestingly enough, I like macroeconomics, which is basically the history of what makes the economy, right?
Mhm.
I'm like love macroeconomics. But yeah, tell us, how did you get to where you got to? Would love to hear some of your origin story.
Well, I'm from Baltimore, and I ended up like the rest of my family, just going into the military. I went into the army out of high school, and we had this sort of idea that you got to serve your country, and then you get out, and then you do your own thing. And while I was in the army, I wanted to go to college, so I went to college after the army and law school, and but I wanted to be a historian. I was like you, right? I was interested in history when I was young, going to Gettysburg Battlefield all the time. And I thought I wanted to be a historian, but my in college, my advisor told me that it would be better for me to be an amateur historian on a lawyer's salary rather than business, rather than a professional historian. So I went to law school like an idiot, and then went into politics, and that's kind of where I started kind of honing this idea. I was thinking about what fascinated me in politics was you get a sense of what people do for their own interests, right? That how to get people to vote, how to create campaigns, how to encourage advocacy. That the number one rule is that you appeal to people's interests. You appeal to not to their broader values, but you appeal to the more mundane values, and that's how you can move people. And I became fascinated with people who actually operated against their interests. To vote, to be active, to do anything in terms of policy and politics that were against their material interests, against the kind of things that we assign to people as being their primary motivators. I thought that was fascinating to get what you needed to do to take the extra step to, in fact, connect with people on a values basis
Mm.
and the kind of deep dive you would have to do to actually get people to move at that point. I was always fascinated by those people, whether they were on the right or on the left. I was just very interested in how people were so committed to a particular set of values that in fact, it informed their politics in a way that they wouldn't move off of those values because most people again they want to stay they're comfortable, they want to stay comfortable, and you pitch them with a message about what's going to keep them comfortable. And so, and I tied that to kind of what was going on with my love of history and my understanding of American politics and American values and how that worked. So when I went after the 2000 cycle, which is a long time ago, I had a choice to either I was offered a job on John Kerry's campaign
Mm.
to go work for him. Had been close to his folks for a while, and but I knew that if I was going to do that, I was at a point in my life that if I was going to do that, then I was just going to spend. I was still relatively young at the time. I was to spend the rest of my life in politics, and do the same kind of thing that political press people do. I had reached a level by then where I was just going to go between being a communications director for an NGO to doing it on the Hill to going to the administration to going to an NGO, and you just keep going on that merry-go-round. And that's fine for a lot of people, but I was wondering whether or not there was something more that I could do based upon my interest in history and kind of exploring that idea of what people did when they acted against their interests as a kind of historical problem to try to understand it. And I thought, given where I was in my interest in American history, then I was really drawn to the founding and the revolution and all this language that we use to justify American politics, to justify our political culture, because so many people, the behavior of so many people in politics is motivated by their understanding of our founding, who we are as an American, where they come from, and that's really what got me. And I was thinking about people who acted within that interest, and so what made me think about resistance was about it came down to the Declaration of Independence. It came down to that last line. It about how the patriots were pledging their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor. And then when I looked more closely at it, I realized that. So I wondered, okay, if these values that we apply to ourselves and that we live by, if they are so universally accepted, and then the patriots were so unique in expressing them and holding them, then who would in fact be against that? Why were there opponents to it? Why? Why would anybody oppose that? Because of their material self-interest, or because they had an ideological attachment to the king, to a monarchy? That struck me as being absurd. But I wanted to know, so maybe I was wrong. So I wanted to know. So I left politics and went to graduate school and started exploring that as a problem to try to answer. And that's what I've been doing all of this time. I'm sort of interested in the people who are acting against their interests, and what that got me really interested in was understanding how power works, and how it really just not as an ideological matter, not as a sort of a class consciousness matter, not as anything like that. But I'm interested in power. and
Yeah.
how people with power, people without power, and what that dynamic is like. Because when power goes too far, which is what all my work's about, when power goes too far, what do people do and respond to that? That's resistance. And it was kind of exploring that as a broader historical problem in that moment of the American Revolution, and then trying to understand that as a broader dynamic that we can apply to other resistance moments in other places at other times. So that's the kind of work that I've been more or less doing for the last 20 years.
I love that, man. It was funny as I didn't know the last line of the Declaration of Independence. I pulled it up. Do you want to say it or do you want me to read it? What would be easier?
Well, why don't you read it? What I remember is that to these principles we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. But it could be something else.
Yes, yeah. That's the last part of it. Yeah. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually
Hmm.
pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Which I didn't even know that.
It's a lovely line, and it ends up being performative because and that's kind of what got me, particularly when I studied under people at great places, is that the easiest thing that you could possibly have done in 1776 was go along with the Patriot. And when you realize that just as a functional matter, and you realize that the people who opposed the Patriots were the ones who were giving up, I don't know anything about sacred honor, but certainly giving up their lives and their fortunes, that to me struck me as a problem that needed to be, if not explained, at least explored.
So when you say the Patriots, you are referring to the Patriots of the United States that didn't exist then, or you're referring to the loyalists of the UK?
Oh no, I mean, I'm referring to, I mean, at that time, at the Declaration of Independence, I mean, I'm looking at the Patriots being the promoters and the movers of independence,
Got
and
it.
the Loyalists as the folks the Americans who thought, no, the independence is not the way to go ahead and resolve this problem.
Right. So when we look back at that time, and I think we're in a time right now where there's like even this weekend's a great example, right? Where with what
Mhm.
happened up in Minnesota, and you had a great piece on that, which I highly recommend everyone checking it out. Um, you have this moment. It's like, well, you got to like don't disobey cops, and I'm like, I listen, like that's a really reasonable statement, by the way, right? Like, hey, like you shouldn't
On its
go to
face, it's
you
yep.
on its surface, hey, you should not go like I wrote like a piece where on Facebook about this, which I'm like, hey, look, like my Second Amendment rights friends, like, is it should you like you should are you concerned about the fact that someone was carrying and got killed just for carrying, like not even holding, like
Mhm.
that's like literally the the acts of like the whole reason there's a Second Amendment,
Mhm.
right? And it's
To keep
like,
the government honest. That's the reason it exists. To keep
and
the government honest. What the hell else is it for?
right, and so and what I found ironic to that, and I don't want to get super political. I actually want to stick to history, but what I found
Yeah.
ironic about that, I was like, well, yeah, but like like if you're that stupid to go to use that right that way, then you got to be okay with the consequences of it. And
Yeah.
it's like
Yep.
so I'm like, wait a second. like so wait and I get it, like actually common sense would say like there's some truth to that, right? That people get scared, they may make mistakes, and you're increasing the odds of those mistakes happening. That's what I say, hey, listen, you are increasing the odds of that mistake happening.
Mhm.
um but um but yeah, it's interesting where it's like if you had that mindset during in the 1770s, you would be a loyalist, right?
Yeah, you would, and that's one of the points that I want to make is that when people right now are talking about what they can do in terms of resistance, and I get asked this question all the time. That there are a lot of people out there who caution against any kind of direct action because of the consequences, the possible consequences of direct action. Violence is one possible consequence. Violence on you, violence on other people, your property damage, and those kind of things. But you've got to understand what those consequences are, and whether or not, just as a values basis, whether or not what it is that you're working for, or the abusive authority that you're operating against, whether or not that is, and what you're willing to risk is of a greater value to end it than the risks that you're willing to run, and that the consequences of that kind of direct action had the patriot resistance of the 1760s and 1770s played by those rules and said, well, there is a certain kind of escalation of resistance that we're not willing to engage in, because if they ever listened to the loyalist argument that we can resolve this through peaceful means, we can resolve this through negotiation, we can resolve this through reform, then they would never have escalated to Lexington and Concord. They certainly will have escalated beyond Lexington and Concord. Lexington and Concord may have happened, but they would never have escalated to independence and to the war. So you get this one section, which I go into in the book, which is about the Patriot resistance. And it goes through all of resistance as a process to help us understand it as a process, as a dynamic. But then they get to they push the abuse of authority back. They bottle up the British in Boston. That their part of the American Revolution is done. They have seen the abuse of authority. They have pushed back against it. They've gone through all of the different dynamics of resistance in order to do that. They've articulated their grievances. They've organized opposition. They've leveraged their resources. They've built their networks, and then they escalate beyond that to make sure that they are compelling the outcome that they want, which is pushing the British back and out. But had they played by the rules that people are applying to today, then none of that happens. And so the question is, do you really think that the abuse of authority that the stakes are that high? And the loyalists at the time, getting to your point, the loyalists at the time would have said the stakes are not that high. That there is nothing that, in fact, because the stakes aren't that high, your rights really aren't being abused by the British government. That the tyranny that you're complaining of is just in your head. That the slavery that you say that you are being threatened with is just a fiction. We can, in fact, do all of the things to protect the rights that you've articulated legitimately. We can do all of that without pulling a trigger.
Yeah.
And the Patriots had a different opinion, and yeah.
So when you say that, it's like my brain goes to two places, and I want to cover the first one. I want to go to the second one. The first one is, as you describe that, I'm hearing that's the Democratic Party, right? I come from a family. My wife's family is like they're Democratic activists, actually, which is interesting if you're a radical moderate like myself, because you'll hear them say stuff, and I'm like that's definitely one side of the story. But what I find is it's like we need a door knock, and we need to, it's all the like, let's work within the system. And they were giving me a hard time because I'm pretty like a moderate. So I'm like, well, I don't like abuse of power. But I also don't think what I said exactly, and you might appreciate this. I said, I don't think the Democrats' plan is working.
Yeah.
Like, I was like, I don't think it's working. Like the system, the going through the systems, if you have a we'll use some of the tactics of a current president. If you have a president that's just willing to like write executive orders that completely disregard the rules of the game, then like you can't. It's like being in a fight and some dude just starts playing dirty. It's like, okay, well, you got to like, what, you gonna sit there and follow the rules? Like you're gonna lose, and if there's no referee, right? So my answer is like, well, shit. Like then we got to think about things differently. So would love, and again, I'm critical of our president in that way. I don't want to make this political, but I'm critical of that, which is like, hey, like writing an executive, and some of his executive orders probably are resulting in some good stuff that I think we should be doing. But I'm curious, like when you look at the Democratic Party and and you talked about this over the weekend or last week about that this doing it this way is not really aligning to this value that we have in the country. I would say that if the point you're trying to make is we are a country of resistance, right? And yet they're not really playing. They're kind of going into a gunfight with a knife, if you will.
Yeah, and that's one of the points of the book is that the gains that this country has achieved in terms of liberty and freedom have been the product of the push and pull of the dynamic of those with power and those without. That those have been achieved through resistance, not through just the beneficence of the founding fathers and the way that their institutions have operated. And I think what we're seeing today, and why it makes it I think valuable, and I think why we're even having this conversation is because people are getting so much of their understanding of the world around them by people whose values have been surrendered to a certain point to partisanship. And if politics at some point is the intersection of values and politics, then at what point do your values and the pursuit of those values become secondary to political goals? And I think we see that on the right and on the left, where the Democratic Party has kind of assumed this kind of loyal opposition role, but they seem to really just care about their place on the table, and that their values are kind of fodder for their political messaging. And so they try to go ahead and activate coalitions of people who ostensibly and historically have values that intersect with what the Democratic Party has traditionally stood for, at least since the end of World War II. And then that happened for a long time until sort of the disruption of the last couple of years. That was the case on the Republican side too. And what we're seeing now, I think, is a disconnect with a lot of people who are seeing these political parties just operating for simply their own benefit as a political institution, rather than actually rather than not actually representing the kind of values that people now see on both the right and the left at risk, under attack.
Yeah.
And so to what extent this is, I work in Democratic Party politics for 10 years, and I consider myself politically on the fairly far left, but that doesn't influence how I look at the history, because that doesn't do anybody any good.
Right.
But we've got to call a spade when it comes to these things, which is why if you care about liberal rights, if you care about human rights and liberty and about a government that will represent them, and if you have values that you think government exists to represent and promote, well, what our problem now is that there are these political parties that are saying that this is the only way in which those values can be represented. So even if we are not pursuing them, your alignment is on us for what we do, and so we're better than the other guy. So you have to go with us. So this kind of adversarial system in which these two parties have just a stranglehold on even our discussion about how values get represented and how we pursue that through these institutions. That's what it comes down to, because it's not really a conversation about competing values and how we achieve them when we're talking about what these political parties are doing. What we have are Democrats that are telling people that what we need to do is maintain the status quo.
Right.
We don't want any change. Is that we're not willing to do things like use the leverage that we have in Congress through parliamentary procedure to bring a stop to this government, wherever you are on that. We're not willing to do that. So if your value is that this government is going too far in its abuse of authority, what we need to do is go ahead and make sure that they are responding in the most clear way with some level of accountability. Shut off the funds. You have the ability to shut off the funds. Shut off the funds. Shut off the funds for a week. Shut off the funds for 2 weeks. Shut off the funds for 3 weeks. Shut off the funds. What these folks are doing is baffling. Baffling. And it's not baffling in American history. This has happened before, but it is a kind of surrender to their own. Getting back to the point, is surrendering to their own political goals, which no longer intersect with the values of a lot of people. And
Yeah.
I think that that's probably happening on the right or left, whether you're purple, or whether you're red or blue. I think that is a conversation that is being forestalled a bit by the fact that there's this unfair political fight between these two parties. And I think that's keeping the rest of us from actually having a broader conversation about why government exists. I mean, it's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Shouldn't we have that conversation? Wouldn't that be a useful conversation for the Declaration of Independence? Is okay. We have these values. What is your perception of these values? Do you think that government in fact exists to go ahead and pursue these things? And do you think that the government we have now is doing that? And to what extent it isn't? What do you think that we should do about it? That would be a valuable conversation. Are we going to have it? No.
Yeah. It says Charlie Munger says, "You show me someone's incentives, I'll show you their behavior." And right now, I think we've created. I look at the system. I'm like, and I'd be curious how you think about this historically. We've created this system where people are perpetually trying to stay in office, right? We don't have it's like becomes this like leverage tool of power. And so they're incentivized to do anything to keep power, right? Because we don't have term limits, which I think is an easy fix. And then we can fund elections with like special interests and with corporations who are now people. And so I'm like, okay, like so basically whoever has the most means can control the power. It's not we the people, it's we the companies, right? It's we the special interests. And those are our puppets that we fund them to do our dirty work or clean work, whatever the perception of that is. And I'm like, well, this is really simple. Like you can't take money from those people, and you only get to stay in office and that
Mhm.
job for X number of years, because we can't create. I don't need a politician that sits in Senate for 45 years.
Mhm.
That's not good for anyone, right?
Mhm.
So I look at that and go, that's an easy fix. Go fix those two things. Oh, and by the way, the people that have the ability to do it have no incentive to do it, so they don't do it,
Well,
right?
that's it. I mean, the easiest fixes are those kind of things, and take the 435 member cap off of the House of Representatives to make sure it reflects the population. Those are legislative fixes. Those are not constitutional fixes. You change the campaign finance laws, make sure that all the things that you just said, right? Term limits. But the problem is, and again, we can make this a historical question,
Right.
is that republicanism the republicanism of most of the core founders, particularly the core nationalists who framed the Constitution, is based upon this idea that our system will work if you elect people of virtue who will act, and that just comes down to one thing: are you going to act in the best interest of yourself or in others? Somebody of virtue will act in the best interest of others. So you need for those people to be in positions of authority, for you to be your representatives and your senators and your president, who will be disinterested enough to be independent enough that they don't have to act in their own self-interest, that they can act in your self-interest. That's virtue to them. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. And they rolled the dice on that, and they were wrong. They were wrong that would, for more than 6 seconds, operate as the main driving force of representatives in government. It lasted maybe 6 seconds, if that. And they rolled the dice on that, and it was a bet that they lost, because the idea, even behind no term limits, or I'm sure you've heard the argument that they have term limits are called elections, that people of virtue would understand that they want to return to the people, they want to return to their private life, that living as a public figure is not a profession, it is a duty. And you
Mm,
exercise your duty, you do it when you're at your best, and then you leave and you let somebody else do it. That kind of presumption vanished. And there are all kinds of reasons why it vanished, but it vanished. And so by the 20th century, when American political culture and American political development sort of accelerated to this point where you have a professional class of people who get there, and I experienced this when I was in politics. The one thing that I knew, it didn't matter how principled a candidate was, even just at their core, principled person. It happened almost every time that when they got through the doors of the Senate, a lot of that would go away quickly, because the most important thing that they want when they get there is not a policy, it's the next term. It's a
mm,
sweet gig. It is very comfortable. It is the closest that we have to an American aristocracy. You get a
wow.
title, you get all these privileges, you're treated as the greatest person on earth, and people love it. It is transformative in these figures. So you get people who get there, and then their ego starts writing checks that their reality can't cash. That they are the ones who desperately need to be there, because all the nice things that people say to them, they start believing. So even somebody like Jim Clyburn, 85 years old, can say, "No, I really need to be here for another term." 85 years old. And you look at the average age of people in the Senate. They think that they have a hold on these things and that they have a particular role to play, when that dynamic right there, that one, is something that, again, that we talk about the vision of the founders, but they were shockingly wrong about a shocking number of things. And that's one of them. And because of that presumption about virtue, there were no safeguards put in at all. And
Wow.
we are, because since then, we continue to reinforce the value of what it is that they created, when even they thought that it should be changed. But we think that, well, no, it can't be changed because it's just too perfect. And we know how much they were wrong about. And now it's almost impossible to fix it. Even as you point out, even that the most easy fixes to really get American political culture on a new stage, they're all legislative, but it is back to where we started. It is against their interest to do so. And that's why they're of the kind of things that I'm interested in, people who act against their interests in favor kind of a higher goal. Not a damn soul in that place is operating in that vein. They're acting in a way that will protect and preserve it. And that's a dynamic that we have seen over and over and over again in American history. And it operates against all resistance.
Yeah, wait. So going to that, like this is this great experiment. To your point, we're 250 years into it this year, um, and you know, if it's happened over and over again, just from your like kind of the highest level view, and you're in these times where it's pretty like, uncomfortable. I think we're in a pretty uncomfortable time. It's the most uncomfortable I've been. I'm 47 years old. With what's happening in our country, I'm like big question mark of how things are going to turn out. I don't think if you ask the average American, they have a lot of confidence in our government. Um, None of that's positive, right? Um, Assuming based on your research, based on your experience, how does it when you look at the different ways it's came out in the past, like, and maybe you look at the closest correlation to what's happening right now, how do you what have been those outcomes? Obviously, they've been positive, or they've been positive enough where we've kept things intact for 250 years. But I'd be curious, like, some examples of how it's turned out in the past.
Um, well, two things. The first one is that it hasn't been intact. That we're under several different governments, and there is it's just part of the narrative that's the same one. It's the oldest operating constitution. It's not the same constitution. Um, that the and that's why historians are more inclined today to think about the United States and talk about the United States in analytical ways, not just in terms of storytelling, but in ways that do actual analytical work, and think about the United States as several different republics. To think about more like the French look at their political history. That the first republic is the constitution that the framers created. And that was based upon these anti-democratic impulses of the Three-Fifths Clause and petty slavery and the broader institutions that evolved around that. That is a whole unique political dynamic. And that ended with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. That it was a wholesale reconstruction of the Constitution, and a new government with new political dynamics emerged from that. And we're increasingly thinking about as the Second Republic. And Eric Foner and Manisha Sinha doing some wonderful work on helping us understand that as not continuity, as a fundamental breach. And it's a different country after that. Same kind of influences, but a different structure because of what it does to the Constitution, to representation, to those things in which we operate within in order to pursue our political lives. And it impacted the Supreme Court, it impacted the presidency, and so it's a different country and a different government. And then you get to the end of the Second Republic, which is around the New Deal. The New Deal is another structural change to American society. Now it focuses on social democracy and social welfare, but it's there to sort of change the relationship of individuals to their government. So you get this massive structural change with everything that the New Deal does, and that creates a kind of third republic that is even more geared towards broader civil liberties. But now what we have is that we're facing sort of, and what a lot of historians are all over the place on this. But what some of us believe is that this is the dismantling of that third republic,
Mm,
that state, particularly the welfare state, particularly all of those elements of the social democratic elements that were built into that, from the New Deal through the Great Society and the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, that we're actually seeing that being dismantled, and the creation of a fourth republic. And we don't know what that's going to look like. But to get to your point, each of those points of transition from one republic to another came with extraordinary conflict. That we don't necessarily think about this when it comes to the New Deal, but the Great Depression was a gut punch to American society, and it hit everybody. And there's a body count there. And without that kind of, but so it's a level of disruption that happens at every single one of those standpoints. None of it happens peacefully. None of it happens easily. And what comes out of each of those points, because our culture doesn't allow for incremental change to go ahead and make structural changes. We have to have ruptures because of the way that the system hasn't worked. So that's why, because we like to think it's a living constitution, that it's all responsive. It's because it hasn't been. It's because our institutions are, and this is just part of analysis, that because our institutions are kind of resistant to all structural change, that it can't
mm,
be responsive. It can't be flexible. That the French can go through 5, 6, 7, 8 republics. I don't know how many they're up to now. Um, but this idea that resistance and opposition is built into French political culture, and it's acceptable. And so the idea is that, well, we've got these values, our values will change and evolve, and our government needs to reflect those values, and we can't let a piece of paper stand in the way of that. We can still operate within these traditions about what we stand for. We can operate within the traditions of the Declaration of Independence. We can operate within those principles as they're established. But we can't let a piece of paper get in the way of us, in fact, achieving those. Um, but in the United States, it does. So every kind of major change has almost required rupture and instability. And I think that's what we're looking at right now. That's what it feels like, at least.
Yeah, no, as you say that, and that I really appreciate the background there because it makes perfect sense. Um, there's a concept in book. I think it's a book called The Fourth Turning. Are you familiar
Mm,
with that?
mm-mm.
It's essentially that every 80 to 100 years you have these like turnovers, right? In their essentially a reinvention of the institutions of society, and it's because the people that are alive weren't alive when when the last one
Yeah.
happened, right?
No, there's a lot to that. I've done some work in terms of looking at resistance. I've done some work looking at what was going on in Ireland in the early part of the 20th century, um, and looking at the Irish Civil War, and looking at the resistance to the British among the Irish, and then the conflict that resulted in Ireland. But the point being is that in doing the work to try to understand the Irish Civil War, there was this massive study done, that it looked at the people who were still alive, who kind of had any kind of knowledge of it. And it was the grandchildren of the people who had lived through the conflict. But it gets exactly to your point, and I think that we're understanding this, that you basically have until your grandchildren before you run out of the lived experience of a historical moment. And so when you forget that, you enter into something new. When that just becomes history to be represented by something else rather than memory that you can act on, then it becomes a different dynamic. And so that is almost sociologically, when people start fracturing because their sense of coherence that an event and a moment might have generated, it all fades away, and you can't hit, no, there's no historian good enough to represent that. You have to do that through lived experience. So we see that though, in the 1820s and 30s, that by the time that the last of the patriots are dying, which is at about the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence by the 1820s. Um, Jefferson and Adams are being asked all the time, we have forgotten what the American Revolution means. We don't know what it means. Can you tell us? We get the fact of independence. We get that we celebrate this on July 4th, but why don't you tell us what the American Revolution means? And they were like, we can't tell you. What the hell are you talking about? Um, because what was being represented to people like Adams about what the American Revolution meant, was completely off base of what he thought it was and what he had experienced it. And he asked Jefferson, "Am I off base with that?" And Jefferson says, "No, nobody's ever going to know about this." So, but the point being is that by the time they get to that third generation, that lived experience that has a kind of cohering effect on society in terms of who people think they are, it starts dissipating. And so what do you and people kind of become uprooted. I don't want to get too far into sociology about that, but it's fascinating to understand that as an actual measurable dynamic, that we have seen in other contexts. And I think that it's interesting that right now, with the generation of World War II going away, that moment and what it meant to create those institutions out of that moment, whether it's the United Nations or other multilateral organizations, or even kind of an understanding approach of what America is and what America means, that is all fracturing at this point too. And I think that it's an important point that you raised. I think it's something that we need to talk about.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're again hearing, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, the supporters of the current administration will say, well, yeah, they're not keeping their end of the bargain, which maybe they're not, and then people that are supporters of the current institutions that we've created out of World War II will make the argument that we're making the world unsafe by breaking these things that have kept the status quo safe. And I look at that, and to your point, like, I mean, I'm a pretty good example, right? I'm 47 years old. My father wasn't even born in this country, but I'm actually kind of reflecting on what's happening in Iran right now because that happened right
Yeah,
when I
sure.
was born, right? And I lived there for
Oh,
a
yeah, yeah, right.
brief moment, right? So my age and what's happening there is like keeps kind of getting thrown in my face. But my mom's parents were Italian. One was born in Italy, came here after World War II. One was a child of the Depression. So I'm curious how you think. Like, I look at it, I'm like, I have direct connection to people who were affected by World War II. That was my grandfather, was fought in World War II. My father was part of a revolution, and my mother and my grandmother, who was one of my favorite people on earth, was a child of the Great Depression. And I remember seeing that,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
it is effect. And but like, my kids are 30 years removed from that.
Yep.
My kids are little, but like, there's a lot of people alive right now that have no connection to that whatsoever. So when they see these things happening around them, they're like, this is the worst thing ever, which is, again, it's uncomfortable. I agree with that. But I'm curious, in your mind, when you see that, or when you look at it historically, does that then create the next moment? Because people don't have that context. They don't have that connection, which allows for like different interpretations of values, different connections to values, a divergence, if you will. And then some new event has to happen to either bring people back together, or break, or create a new.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like the discussion. I'm sure that you can speak a lot to this. Is about, well, is the son of the Shah at all a figure of authority in Iran and in Iran's broader in the broader Iranian community? I mean, is that how does that work? Somebody who hasn't been there since 1970, how does that work? And that is kind of a case of memory in action. Is he kind of trading on that memory among people in Iran who are older and who kind of remember that moment? And what does that mean to like your kids? What does that mean to people who are part of kind of the broader Iranian community and Iranian Americans? So what does he mean when he wants to offer himself up as a figure of authority? But getting to the point that it is one of the things I think that happens is that, particularly when with institutions like NATO's a good example of this, is that people sort of forget why it was created, and it is that it is they either forget, or I mean, sort of the point. Well, do they have to sort of let go? It's that they're never there in the first place.
Mm.
And so it has to kind of be justified to them why there is this multilateral organization that is doing this. Now they can put it in the language of what came out of what came out of World War II. The United Nations too is that there has to be, for them, when you get past that memory of why these institutions exist, why these frameworks exist, you have to actually have a coherent, positive argument that resonates about why we engage in any of these things. For a lot of people, that work's already done for them by their own history. They don't need to be taught that. That doesn't need to come from the outside. They have it. They have it from within. Um, Now we're in this moment where all of these institutions that are creaking and collapsing, that they are all part of that historical moment. And so Mark Rutte can go up there and say whatever he wants about the importance of NATO, but Europeans have a much different idea of what NATO does now than what NATO used to do.
Mm.
And obviously the current leaders of the United States have a much different idea of NATO. But is that a point where people are saying that, actually these institutions, in fact, are no longer fit for purpose in our world? That these are responding to a threat that no longer exists, at least in that way. And so continuing to go ahead and constrain yourself to think that those institutions are so great that they need to remain forever, rather than they need to be adapted to meet a current moment that more younger people are seeing in their own experience. This gets to your point that younger people are creating their own experience about what's around them that will then shape what comes next. That is divorced from that. And there's no historian that's going to be able to go ahead and continue to hold on to those other moments and to explain the legitimacy of those frameworks and of that mindset to younger people today who find them to be alien. I'm teaching young folks right now, and they haven't the faintest clue about World War II. I mean, they get kind of what
Wow.
what they hear, but they haven't the faintest clue. It might as well be World War I. It might as well be the American Civil War. It might as well be all that. So it's about how can you take their view of the world now and seeing how mad it is and how unstable it is, and to see how that instability is giving them a sense of further instability, because all of these institutions, like 80 some year old members of Congress, are holding on to their legitimacy and relevance for dear life, rather than saying, rather than being responsive to the kind of threats and challenges that are in front of people right now. And it's the lack of that responsiveness is why the League of Nations collapsed, right? I mean, it's the lack of that responsiveness, that ability to kind of, risk change, but gain, that is standing in the way, I think, of a lot of people right now. They're holding on to something else, and that something else isn't is that might be the biggest breach generationally right now, is that older people are hanging on to this view of the world that they still think exists but doesn't anymore, and younger people see that that version of the world is crazy because it doesn't apply to what's going on right now, and so it's almost impossible to bridge that gap.
I have a question for you. Look, and I don't even know why I didn't even think about that. To obviously going over your bio. I mean, obviously you're around a lot of young folks, and so when you see how they're, like, I mean, even what you just said a moment ago, where I'm like, oh shit, yeah, you're right. Like World War II might as well be the Civil War. That's
Hmm.
crazy in my mind because I'm 47. I grew up around a
Hmm.
ton of World War II vets. Right?
Yep.
They were older men. They were probably they were like my age when I was a kid. Right? And so like that's like I remember like that's a big like even though it's not like I was born 30 years after World War II ended, um, it's still a thing where like it was relevant, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
The Cold War was the thing I grew up around, right? Which
Hmm.
came out of that. So when for me, I'm like again, I think if you're Gen X or you're in 40s or 50s, like we're kind of like this great connector of those two pieces. But how yeah, what are your thoughts when you see them and when you kind of take your work around resistance history and you see the youngsters out there? How does what are your thoughts around the connection point there and how they're taking that ideology?
They are more responsive to understanding power dynamics as a framework, and understanding that the historical examples are ones that can be applied, but isn't a part of their lived experience. So it's really interesting that my father served in World War II, but for these kids that might as well have been Bunker Hill. Um, that and but even to the point, like for us, I'm 55, and I was in the army in Germany when the wall came down in 1989 and 1990. But they don't even understand the Cold War. They don't understand a Soviet Union. They don't understand what was going on there. Even in Europe, where there are a lot of people where it's with a lived memory of this, they don't understand that either. And so what they do understand is power and its abuse. And because they see that all around them, and you try to go ahead and go to where they are and what they're seeing in terms of how people abuse that authority. And they are, and into what they think is sort of what they think are the kind of avenues for addressing it. What's most interesting about talking to young people, whether it's through digital engagement or whether it's in the classroom, is that I've been really impressed by young people. I mean, that to the extent that there's like hope, right? I mean, is that I am, whether it's the United States or in Europe, I am shockingly impressed by young people. They have a clarity of understanding the world around them that I didn't have at that age. And while there is a mindset of a lot of them that verges on cynicism, but is certainly a healthy skepticism about anyone in a position of authority and what they're saying. That really makes you think that there is kind of a creative synergy in that, to overuse a business dynamics term. There's kind of a creative synergy in that they are not wedded to these institutions. And they're starting to figure out what it means to have these principles, because what interests them, which a lot of the folks I talk to, are the things that interest me. Is that why do people do things against their interests? Because they're growing up in a world in which material culture is such a big driving force all around them. And so what do people do? Authenticity is their favorite word. Right? They, of course, they use other words, but I'm not going to embarrass myself to use. But it comes down to people who are authentic, people who are real, and for them, that means people who are acting based upon their own values rather than responding to a kind of external value that other people should apply to. I find that to be refreshing, because you can have a much more honest conversation about how that works in politics, how that works in history, without sort of a lot of the baggage that I'm sure that I had at that age.
Interesting. Oh, I know we're running out of time. I just had one last question, and I don't know if you'll have time to answer it, but and then we'll get to the greatness question. When you talk about resistance history, like this is from earlier in the show, but I have to ask it because I think that if you're on one side of the aisle versus the other, then the resistance is real, right? For
Mhm.
both, right? So I'll use the Civil War for example. in the Civil War, one could argue there was a resistance from the South to the North because they were trying to change their way of life, and they fought for it, right? And then the other argument would be that there was a resistance from the North against the South because of their way of life. So when you talk about resistance, is it that both sides have their own perspective and resist against each other, and then some new comes out of it? Or is it that there is one person, we'll use the example of, let's say, to what's happening today with ICE, right? Where you're seeing a resistance against authoritarian like behavior, or the overreach of authority, potentially, depending on how you see it. And that's a little bit less arguable that there's that ICE is just enforcing the law, quote unquote, and people resisting them, quote unquote, enforcing the law. That seems like not binary, right?
Mhm.
Versus what the example of the Civil War, because I think that when again, being a radical moderate as I am, I see both people resisting each other right now. I see both sides. And I had a friend make a comment to me. She's like, how are you friends with these people on my on my Facebook post? Because how can you be friends with someone like that is an Islamophobe? And I'm like, I'm not friends with someone that's an Islamophobe, but I can understand their fear, right?
Mhm.
Um, I don't agree with it, but I'm empathetic that they're just have that fear because people kind of fear about stuff. So I'm curious, when you talk about resistance history and you look at it as it's framed in today's political context, using that example from the Civil War, wondering how you think about that.
It's a really good point, and I think about this a lot because the basic thing is that resistance dynamics are values agnostic. That it's about those with power, those without power, and what happens when that becomes unbalanced. And so you can understand how resistance moves from protest to opposition to escalate to action. Um, that is not based upon the political values or ideology of any in between. That we can apply that to all kinds of contexts, like you're saying. So we can apply that to the Civil War. We can try to see whether or not that works for the states that become the Confederacy. We can see how that works for the Union. So resistance dynamics is actually a framework that we can apply in terms of analyzing history and dynamics in almost any content. We can see how it works. Now, but that doesn't mean that within that dynamic, it has operated more consistently um, on the liberal side of the liberal conservative spectrum, um, because of the way that, and this is sort of a product of resistance studies, that conservative regimes, as opposed to liberal regimes, and there are both sides, but conservative regimes tend to operate in ways that are that oppress any kind of resistance from being just
Mm,
the way that they're structured, the way that they're formed, even ideologically, the way that they're formed, that keeps resistance from emerging, from evolving, that keeps protest and opposition. So the dynamic is almost immediately truncated. It's very difficult. So when we see those, it almost is like a flat triangle when you're looking at it in in abusive authority on the conservative end. But abusive authority in the liberal end will use some of the same tools. We're talking about sort of liberalism in that sense. However, under when a resistance is representing what we consider to be classical liberal values, that tends to have a much more powerful moral foundation for escalating resistance than conservative values. And that's a very interesting dynamic. And that's why when we look at it, we almost always see it escalating in more mature ways against a conservative authority, with a liberal or liberal oriented. I'm talking about classical, not political, sort of a
yeah,
liberal
no,
oriented resistance to it. So that's a very interesting way to think about it. That it doesn't conservative resistance isn't very good. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't escalate very well.
yeah,
Um,
it's
it's not that
interesting.
it doesn't. It's not that it doesn't, but it just doesn't. It doesn't develop the same way that liberal resistance does, because the liberal resistance tends to be able to draw on other kinds of reservoirs, whether they're emotional, but particularly they're kind of moral reservoirs. Kind of like there's a level of sanctimony I think that liberals have, that they're able to kind of draw on, that are able to give them a sense of identity that is separate from the state. And that is, I think, a fascinating dynamic. We see that going on in the United States. That's why when we look at the Civil War, the the resistance there, I don't think is on the side of the Confederacy. I see the Confederacy as being a continuity of maintaining the authority of the First Republic. I mean, the reason why they want the separation is because they want to maintain the Constitution as it was. They don't want the Republicans to touch the Constitution. They like
Mm.
it as it was. Um, and it was that threat, even though Lincoln's never going to follow through on it, right? I mean, Lincoln, the most milquetoast president in American history. It's insane the kind of attention that he gets. We'll leave that to the side. But it's that this idea that they want to keep things the same in terms of that constitution or whatever text and whatever represents. And so there has to be kind of a resistance that evolves to that. And so I think that's an interesting. It's not. I don't know if it's an ideological dynamic, but it's been interesting to see because I've looked at resistance dynamics not just through U.S. history, but try to really understand it. I've looked deeply at it in Southeast Asia, and I've looked at it in Europe, particularly Europe in the 20th century and Southeast Asia in the 20th century, to kind of see how they operate. And it is that spectrum that determines how resistance movements emerge and evolve and change. And it's strikingly different if it's in a kind of conservative setting or whether it's in a liberal setting.
Yeah, what I picked up from what you just put down is like, and I was like, oh, okay, gotcha. Conservatives want to conserve their whatever systems are in play, and then that's not necessarily. I'm making a totally like blanket statement that there's plenty of examples that go. Like you could argue right now that the current administration that is quote unquote conservative is tearing down systems that have stayed in place. So that would be a resistance to old institutions. But using the example you made was we have this. We're conserving the system we like, and like whether that's Jim Crow post, like civil rights, whether that's, there's a ton of them, right? But
Hmm.
we're trying to conserve the status quo. We're trying to keep slavery in place. We're trying to,
Hmm.
you know, you know, keep whatever it is that we don't want change to happen. Get off my lawn, right? Type of deal. And then you got the hippies that come in and are like, we got to change this. This is fucked up.
Hmm.
And to your point, that tends to be more a liberal mentality versus a conservative mentality. So I understand that.
Yeah.
Or even like if you talk about like the environment, that we want to
Yeah.
conserve the current like systems that keep oil and gas doing what it's
Yeah.
doing, and people say no, we want to change that, and there's a big fight there because we're trying to evolve or progress or be more progressive, right? So I can see how that creates friction.
And I think that it's an interesting kind of political science discussion to have because it ultimately comes down to the health of your political system in terms of how responsive is it to change, even major change. As you pointed out, that conservative systems tend not to be responsive because they tend to want to reinforce existing establishment institutions. Um, Whereas if you have, and one of the things that makes sort of modern European democracy so interesting is that they are strikingly responsive to change, particularly in Northern Europe and in the Baltics. They're strikingly responsive to change, and I think that rather than being an American system that tends to suppress any change and make it incremental, make it reform. You have to, and that requires that you have to reach the point of destabilizing breach for any meaningful change to happen. Whereas in other places, you can be much more flexible, whether you are on, the right or the left, as long as the extremes are managed. You can be much more flexible because the system is responsive. I think
Mhm.
that's an interesting conversation to have.
Interesting. Tad, I want to respect your time. I know we're running over a little bit.
For sure.
But first of all, before we got on the show, we talked about Tad's book. He's anti-promoting his book. I'm going to promote it. It's coming out June 2nd. You guys need to go buy it. Help him. I mean, look, your content is fascinating. I'm excited to read the book. I love your content. You guys need to check out his content. So, the book is a resistance history of the United States. Obviously, you could tell from this conversation, there's so much there for us to discuss and people to learn from. But Tad, why don't you tell people where they could get the book? I know it's coming out. They could pre-order it, where they can learn more about you on social, and then we'll go to the greatness question.
If you got to get the book, spend as little for as you can, because I want you to rip it apart. I want you to mark it up. I want you to use it. But go to your local independent bookseller. They rock. They're doing the work of the Lord out there. So go to your local independent bookseller. Those are my people. And in terms of finding me, it's Tad Stoermer. I'm everywhere. So just Tad Stoermer. I don't have a tagline. I don't have merch. It's just my name. And I'm on YouTube and Instagram and what's left of TikTok, and I have a Substack. The standard things, but I just don't do any dances or get ready with me.
No, more than that, he teaches us important history. So you can have some. Honestly, I'll tell you what, man, your content has been for me very refreshing to feel understanding that this is not a new that's happening right
Yeah.
now. And for me, that was really like that's what got me into your stuff. I'm like, oh, like the forefathers did what? Like this has happened many times before, and this is the context around. That's crazy. I didn't know Lincoln did that, right? And so for anyone that likes to learn about history and not just like assume that this is like the end of the world and this is just part of evolution, and the Tad's work gives some great context. So you guys, we'll go and we'll put that in the show notes. So please go check it out. And I love you on Instagram. I'm all over his Instagram. You guys need to check that out, as well as YouTube and his Substack. So we'll go and put that in the show notes. With that said, Tad, you ready for the greatness question?
Sure.
All right. What is the number one barrier to creating greatness that you've overcome in your life, and how did you overcome it?
The risk of loss. I think that it's got to be the willingness to sort of let go of who you were and kind of the comfort in that, to achieve something more and of greater value. And that is about, and I think that to the extent that I've been able to achieve anything, it was through kind of letting that part of you go, to think that something else was actually you're going to achieve something better, through that. And that happened to me when I left the army to go to college, left when I left politics to go to graduate school, and it happened when I kind of left a kind of very comfortable academic existence to focus on understanding resistance and what it means to people. Is that you got to let go of that in order to, I think, really achieve, and then you can define yourself what greatness is within that.
I love that, man. Tad, so much gratitude from us here at the Greatness Machine for you coming on today. Thank you so much. So excited for the work you're doing. Thank you, my friend.
It's been my pleasure, Darius. You've asked me questions that I don't normally get, which I mostly appreciate. I like new, and I like thinking about it in these kind of ways that you push people to think about. So I really appreciate you helping me.
Thank you so much, guys. Please share this. As leaders, we like to share great information, so please share Tad's work. Until next time, peace out, everybody. We love you.
You are listening to The Greatness Machine, and that's a wrap for today. Listen, if you love what you heard, subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform that you're tuning in on so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. We have tons of great people coming on, and we're stoked to have you here to enjoy it with us. Leave us a review. Tell us what you love most about this particular episode. We love getting the reviews. We love to see what you guys love most. And if this particular episode, made you think of someone who's leveling up in their business and in their life, print screen, share it with them. Leaders are the best givers, and after all, we're all here to support and grow with each other. And in case you want to see some of the fun behind the scenes shots or some of the things that we're doing, I'm actually writing about this in my weekly newsletter. Go to www.therealdarius.com and subscribe to my newsletter. We're talking about fun things like business and life and mindfulness and cryptocurrencies and gosh, I don't even know, everything and anything, but it's tons of fun stuff I write about. I try to get it out on a weekly basis. You can subscribe at www.therealdarius.com. And with that said, look, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. I love you. Peace. We're out of here. See you guys on the next one.
She's my lover.